The clock ticked relentlessly as the students sat in the examination hall, their pens poised over crisp, white papers. The atmosphere was thick with tension, not because of the difficulty of the exam, but because of the strange, unsettling rumors circulating in the school. It was the final exam of the year at Crawford High, and while the school had always been known for its intense academic pressure, today felt different. There was an eerie silence in the air, as if something far more sinister than a simple test was about to unfold. Among the students was Alex, a senior who had always been a bit of an outcast. He was seated at the back of the room, nervously tapping his foot, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled in his chest since the night before. He'd heard whispers of students disappearing, strange noises in the hallways after dark, and most disturbingly, sightings of people acting off. But, of course, no one believed it. At least, not yet. The school bell rang sharply, signaling the start of the exam. The room immediately fell into a hush, the only sound the rustling of papers as students began writing. Alex glanced up at the clock again, 9 a.m. He took a deep breath and focused on the test in front of him, attempting to push away the feeling of dread gnawing at the back of his mind. It was just an exam, right? But then, there was a loud crash. A thundering noise from the hallway outside the exam room. The students looked up, startled. Another crash, followed by a strange, guttural sound, almost like a growl. The proctor, Mr. Willis, an elderly teacher who had been at Crawford for decades, frowned but didn't move to investigate. He simply adjusted his glasses and nodded to the students to continue. Alex, however, couldn't ignore the sounds. His heart pounded as he slowly stood up, his chair scraping noisily against the floor. He made his way to the door, his mind racing. The other students were too engrossed in their tests to notice, but Alex felt an intense need to know what was happening. He peered through the small window in the door and immediately recoiled in shock. A group of figures stood at the end of the hallway. At first, Alex thought they were students, but there was something horribly wrong. Their movements were jerky, and their faces were twisted in grotesque expressions. One of them turned and met Alex's gaze. Its eyes were vacant, lifeless. The creature let out a low, rasping growl that made Alex's blood run cold. It wasn't a student. It was something else. Alex's breath caught in his throat as the realization hit him. The rumors, they were true. The school wasn't just dealing with a regular exam today, they were facing something far more dangerous. And now, they were all trapped in the exam hall with no way out. He backed away from the door, his mind racing. He needed to warn everyone, but how? The proctor was still sitting at his desk, oblivious to the danger, and the other students were completely unaware of the horror unfolding just outside the door. As Alex turned to return to his seat, the lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows across the room. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Then, suddenly, the classroom door slammed open. The students jumped, startled by the sound, and turned to see what had caused the disturbance. Standing in the doorway was a disheveled figure, its clothes torn and stained with blood. It was one of the students, or, at least, it used to be. Now, it was something else entirely. Its skin was pale, its eyes sunken and glazed over. A grotesque snarl twisted its face as it staggered forward, arms outstretched, as if searching for its next victim. Alex froze, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. The student, or whatever it had become, lunged forward with a horrifying shriek. A nearby student screamed and backed away, but it was too late. The creature grabbed hold of the girl, its teeth sinking into her neck with terrifying force. Blood splattered across the floor, and the room erupted into chaos. "Get away from her!" Alex shouted, his voice hoarse with fear. But the words seemed useless. The creature was too fast, too ferocious. The other students scrambled to their feet, some shouting, others crying. Panic spread like wildfire. Alex knew that they were no longer just taking an exam. The real test had begun, a test of survival. Those who failed would not just flunk the test, they would become part of the very nightmare that had invaded the school. The creatures outside, and now inside, weren't just looking to kill. They were looking to turn their victims into one of them. "Get to the back of the room," Alex yelled, trying to rally the others. But it was clear that some were already too far gone, caught in the grip of fear and disbelief. As the screams intensified, Alex realized one horrifying truth: in this exam, failure didn't mean a bad grade. It meant becoming one of them. The room was in chaos. Desks were overturned, chairs were scattered across the floor, and screams echoed through the hallways. The once quiet, sterile atmosphere of the exam hall had transformed into a battlefield, with the sounds of flesh being torn apart and desperate cries filling the air. Alex stood frozen for a moment, his mind struggling to process the horrific scene unfolding before him. The creature that had attacked the student was now dragging its victim across the floor, blood staining the tiles. The girl's body was limp, her once bright eyes now clouded and lifeless. The others were still in shock, some standing at the back of the room, others crouching behind desks, too terrified to move. It was clear that panic had taken over, and any semblance of control was slipping away quickly. "Is this really happening?" one of the students whispered, her voice trembling with fear. Alex didn't have an answer. All he knew was that he needed to act, and fast. The door to the exam hall was wide open, and the creatures from the hallway were already beginning to pour inside. There was no way out through the front, not anymore. The only option was to try to escape through the back. "We need to move," Alex said, his voice steady despite the fear rising in his chest. "Follow me, and stay low." He didn't wait for a response. With adrenaline pumping through his veins, he made his way toward the back of the room, stepping carefully over the broken pieces of desks and chairs. His eyes flicked between the terrified students, searching for any signs of movement or understanding. Some were still paralyzed by fear, while others were beginning to snap into survival mode, looking for ways to defend themselves or escape. Alex reached the back door of the classroom, his heart racing. He pushed it open cautiously, peering into the hallway beyond. The hallway was filled with the same horrors as the exam room. The creatures were everywhere, dragging their victims, growling and snarling. They were relentless, moving with a terrifying speed and purpose. As Alex turned back to the group, he saw that a few students had begun to follow him. A tall, athletic boy named Jake, along with two others, had managed to push past the panic and were now moving toward the door. But there was no time to waste. The creatures would be upon them soon if they didn't get out of the school. "We can't just stand here," Jake said, his voice gruff but determined. "We need to get to the exit." Alex nodded in agreement. He had no idea where the nearest safe place was, but he knew that staying in the school was not an option. The creatures outside weren't the only threat. As the hallway grew more crowded with the undead, the group's chances of survival would decrease rapidly. "All right," Alex said, his mind racing. "We head for the back exit. There's a service door near the gym, I think. If we can make it there, we might have a chance." The group nodded, and Alex motioned for them to follow. They moved swiftly but cautiously, ducking low to avoid being seen. Each step felt like an eternity, and the sounds of the creatures growing louder with each passing moment made the tension unbearable. The group had made it to the hallway, but the exit was still a long way off, and they weren't the only ones trying to escape. Around the corner, Alex saw a few other students, some of them armed with makeshift weapons, broken broomsticks, fire extinguishers, and even a metal chair leg. They were fighting back, but it was clear that their chances were slim. The creatures were too powerful, too numerous. Alex felt a pang of guilt in his chest, but he knew that he couldn't help them. He had to keep moving. The hallway was like a maze, with classrooms and lockers lining the walls. Alex led the group down a narrow corridor, hoping to avoid the main throng of monsters in the larger hallways. But luck was not on their side. As they rounded a corner, they were met by a sight that made Alex's heart drop into his stomach. A creature was standing right in front of them, blocking their path. It was another student, one Alex recognized from his history class. He had been a quiet, unremarkable kid until now. Now, his face was twisted in a grotesque snarl, and his hands were covered in blood. The creature's eyes locked onto Alex, and it let out a blood-curdling scream. Without thinking, Alex grabbed Jake's arm and pulled him back. "Move! Now!" The group scrambled to retreat, but the hallway was too narrow. The creature lunged toward them with terrifying speed, its jaws snapping shut just inches from Alex's face. He managed to dodge, but the creature's claws raked across his arm, leaving deep, painful gashes. Blood dripped down his sleeve, but there was no time to stop and tend to the wound. "Go, go, go!" Alex shouted. Jake swung the metal chair leg at the creature, knocking it back temporarily. The group continued to retreat, adrenaline surging as they fought to stay ahead of the undead. The creature's shriek echoed behind them, but they didn't stop. They couldn't. As they reached the service door, Alex glanced over his shoulder, his mind racing. The creatures were closing in fast, and they weren't alone. The rest of the school was quickly becoming overrun. What had started as an ordinary exam was now the fight of their lives, a fight where failing the test meant far more than a bad grade. It meant becoming one of them. The service door slammed shut behind them with a loud, metallic clang. Alex leaned against it, his heart hammering in his chest, and his breath coming in ragged gasps. The small group of students had managed to escape the exam hall, but they were far from safe. The school was quickly descending into madness, and the creatures were everywhere. The once familiar hallways and classrooms now felt like a death trap, and the reality of what was happening weighed heavily on Alex's shoulders. "Is everyone all right?" Alex asked, turning to the others. He winced as he wiped the blood from his arm, the wound still stinging, but there was no time to stop and assess it. He had to focus on getting everyone to safety. Jake, the tall athletic boy, was the first to respond. He glanced around, counting the students in their group. "We're all here. But we need to move. If we stay here too long, they'll find us." Alex nodded, and the group began to move quickly down the narrow corridor leading toward the gym. The school's interior was eerily quiet now, save for the distant moans and growls of the undead. Each step seemed to echo too loudly, and Alex felt his pulse quicken with every passing second. "We should split up," suggested another student, Sarah, a quiet girl from Alex's class who had been crouching behind a desk during the attack. "It'll be harder for them to find us if we're spread out." Alex considered this for a moment. It made sense, but at the same time, he wasn't sure if it was the right call. The creatures were unpredictable. Splitting up could make them easy targets. But staying together might also draw too much attention. Before he could answer, Jake spoke up, his voice stern. "No. We stick together. We don't know what's out there, and we don't know who can be trusted. It's safer if we stay as one group." The others murmured their agreement, though Alex could see doubt in their eyes. Trust was going to be as much a challenge as surviving the creatures outside. They had already been through hell in the last hour, and none of them knew who might crack under the pressure. Alex pushed the thoughts from his mind and led the way forward, his focus narrowing on the hallway ahead. They reached the gym doors, but when Alex tried to open them, he found them locked. "What the hell?" he muttered, trying again. The door wouldn't budge. He glanced around, searching for another way in, but there was nothing in sight. "Let me try," Jake said, stepping forward. He pulled a fire extinguisher from a nearby wall and swung it at the door's glass. It shattered with a loud crash, and he quickly began to reach through the broken glass, attempting to unlock it from the inside. Alex heard the familiar growl of a creature coming from down the hall, and his heart skipped a beat. They didn't have much time. "I don't know how much longer we have," Alex said, his voice tight with urgency. "We need to get in, now." Almost there, Jake grunted as he finally managed to unlatch the door. He pushed it open just as the first creature appeared in the hallway. It was stumbling toward them, its eyes vacant, mouth hanging open in a grotesque snarl. "Inside. Now!" Alex shouted. The group rushed into the gym, slamming the door shut behind them. They were safe, for the moment. The gymnasium, usually a place of school events and sports, now felt like a temporary shelter. Alex locked the door, his hands shaking from the adrenaline. But their relief was short-lived. The sound of pounding feet echoed from the other side of the door. The creatures were already starting to swarm the gymnasium. "We're not safe here for long," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to come up with a plan," Jake said, looking around the room. "We can't stay here forever." The gym was large, and the high ceilings gave them a sense of space, but there were limited exits. The windows were high and too small to climb through, and the only other exit was the one they'd just used. They were trapped. Alex paced back and forth, trying to think of a solution. His mind was racing, but everything seemed too chaotic. Then it hit him, the school's maintenance tunnels. He remembered hearing about them in passing, but he'd never thought they would be useful for anything like this. "The maintenance tunnels," Alex said, his voice gaining confidence. "They lead out to the back of the school. If we can get to them, we might have a chance." Jake looked at him skeptically. "The maintenance tunnels? Are you sure?" Alex nodded. "I'm sure. I've seen the access points before. We just need to find one." The group quickly agreed, and they began to search the gym. They found a small door near the back wall, half hidden by a pile of gym mats. It was locked, but Jake, ever resourceful, quickly found a crowbar and pried it open. "Let's move," Alex urged, as he stepped through the door, the others following close behind. The narrow hallway beyond smelled damp and musty, and the flickering light overhead cast eerie shadows on the walls. They moved cautiously, the sound of their footsteps too loud in the oppressive silence. Alex led the group through the dark, winding tunnels, his mind focused on the goal, escape. But even as they moved deeper into the school's hidden passageways, a gnawing feeling of unease settled over him. This was a test of more than just survival. It was a test of trust. Who could they rely on to keep them safe? Who would break under the pressure? As the group continued through the tunnels, the quiet became unbearable. Alex couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. And that's when he heard it, a noise behind them. A soft shuffle. A step. A breath. He turned to find one of the students from the group trailing behind, a wild look in their eyes. The test wasn't over. And trust, it seemed, was the most dangerous challenge of all. The noise echoed in the narrow tunnel. A soft shuffle, followed by a sharp breath, and then a whisper. Alex's instincts flared. Something was off. His eyes darted back over his shoulder, scanning the group. There were still 6 of them, moving silently through the dark passage. But one of them, Sarah, the quiet girl who had suggested splitting up earlier, was trailing behind. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and distant, as though she wasn't entirely present. "Sarah, keep up," Alex called softly, trying not to alert the others. But her response was slow, as if she hadn't heard him at all. The group moved forward, but Alex stayed back, watching her every step. The unsettling feeling in his gut was growing. He wasn't sure why, but something about Sarah didn't sit right. He remembered how quickly she had agreed to go into the tunnels, how easily she had fallen in line with the others. She hadn't been as vocal as the rest, yet she hadn't hesitated to follow their lead, even when the plan seemed desperate. Alex's suspicion deepened as he caught a glimpse of her face. Her lips were parted, her eyes unfocused, staring ahead with an almost trance-like expression. Something wasn't right. "Sarah?" Alex said again, his voice firmer this time. She didn't respond. She was too far gone, or maybe she was just pretending. Alex couldn't tell. He stepped closer, his breath catching as he realized just how much she had changed. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, like a marionette being controlled by invisible strings. And then, she let out a soft, almost imperceptible growl, a sound Alex had heard only once before. It was the unmistakable sound of a creature. Alex's heart dropped. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Sarah wasn't just lagging behind. She had been infected. Somehow, during their escape, she had fallen victim to the creatures. And now, she was one of them. Shit, Alex muttered under his breath, but it was too late. Before he could react, Sarah lunged. Her body moved with terrifying speed, faster than anything Alex had seen from the infected students before. She grabbed Jake's arm, her grip tightening with unnatural strength. Jake yelped in pain, trying to wrench his arm free, but Sarah didn't let go. Her eyes locked onto his, vacant and glassy, her mouth twitching as though searching for something to bite into. "Get her off me!" Jake shouted, panic rising in his voice. Alex reacted instantly. His mind raced, but his body moved on pure instinct. He lunged forward, grabbing Sarah by the shoulders and pulling her away from Jake. But she was stronger than he expected. Her skin was cold and clammy, her muscles rigid, as if they were working against him. "Hold on!" Alex grunted, struggling to push her back. But then, everything seemed to shift in that moment. A sudden burst of noise erupted from the group as another student, Mark, stepped forward with a crowbar in his hand. His eyes were wild, but there was a desperate determination in them. "Get back, Alex!" Mark shouted, and before Alex could react, Mark swung the crowbar with all his strength. The crowbar connected with Sarah's side, sending her flying back against the tunnel wall with a sickening crack. For a moment, there was silence. The group stood frozen, staring at Sarah's crumpled body. Her head lolled to the side, her once human eyes now empty and lifeless. But then, she slowly stirred. "She's not done," Alex said, his voice tense. "She's still." Before he could finish, Sarah let out a guttural growl and began to rise again. Her movements were slow at first, but they quickly became more erratic, more desperate. The infection had fully taken hold of her, and now there was nothing left but the monstrous instincts of the undead. "Shit!" Mark swore, taking another swing with the crowbar. This time, it hit Sarah square in the head, and she collapsed, her body twitching in a final, violent spasm. Alex watched the scene unfold with a mix of disbelief and disgust. Sarah was gone, and the group was left to pick up the pieces. There was no time for mourning. Not anymore. Is she really gone?" Jake asked, his voice low, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and disbelief. Alex nodded grimly. "Yeah. She's gone. And so are we if we don't keep moving." The group didn't need to be told twice. The entire situation had changed in an instant. They weren't just trying to survive anymore, they were trying to outsmart a virus that turned people into monsters. And now, there was a new challenge. One that they hadn't anticipated. Who could they trust? Alex's mind raced. He had seen the betrayal in Sarah's eyes, or maybe it had been something else. Maybe she hadn't been fully infected at first. Maybe she had been hiding it, pretending to be one of them until it was too late. But the thought of someone among them turning into a creature without warning sent a chill down his spine. There was a new reality now. The test wasn't just about escaping the creatures outside. It was about surviving each other. "We keep moving," Alex said, trying to push the fear from his voice. "We can't stop. We need to get to the maintenance tunnels and out of here. There's no time to question who's infected and who's not. We move as a team, or we don't move at all." Mark gave a curt nod, his face grim. "Agreed. Let's go." The group pressed forward, the weight of Sarah's betrayal hanging heavily in the air. But Alex knew that trust was a luxury they could no longer afford. They were alone, and every decision, every movement, could be the difference between life and death. The door ahead loomed in the dark tunnel. It was the only way out. But Alex couldn't shake the feeling that someone else in their group might not be who they appeared to be. The test was far from over. In fact, it had only just begun. The tension inside the narrow tunnel was unbearable. The faint flicker of light from the overhead bulbs cast long shadows against the damp walls, distorting the faces of the remaining students. Alex led the group forward, but his thoughts were racing. Every step they took seemed to carry them deeper into a labyrinth of fear and uncertainty. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. They weren't just running from the creatures anymore. Now, they were running from something more insidious, the fear that the people they were with could turn on them at any moment. As they moved through the winding tunnel, Alex couldn't help but glance at the faces of the others. Mark, Jake, and the others kept their heads down, eyes scanning the path ahead, but Alex could sense their unease. No one spoke. It was as though the group had lost its ability to communicate. What was once a group of classmates had now become something much darker, a group of survivors, unsure of who they could trust, and terrified of the consequences if they made the wrong choice. They reached a fork in the tunnel, the dark path splitting into two directions. One path led toward what Alex remembered to be the school's maintenance rooms, while the other seemed to wind down deeper into the earth. The air smelled damp, heavy with the scent of decay. "We need to decide," Alex said, his voice a little strained. "One of these leads out, and the other, who knows?" Jake stepped forward, eyes narrowed. "Are you sure you know which way?" Alex hesitated, his mind working quickly. He'd been in the school for years, but the maze of tunnels wasn't something anyone had mapped out. It was supposed to be for maintenance workers and custodians, not students. And now, that lack of knowledge was working against him. "I'm not sure," Alex admitted. "But we have to make a decision. If we don't, we'll just be lost down here. We'll run out of time." The group exchanged uncertain glances. There was no time for indecision. But who could they trust to make the right choice? The moment Sarah had been revealed as one of the undead, Alex knew that no one could be trusted implicitly anymore. Mark's firm jaw tightened as he scanned both paths, obviously weighing the situation carefully. "We can't keep standing around like this," Mark said, his voice sharp with frustration. "We need to move, Alex. If you're not sure, then I'll choose. We're wasting time." Before Alex could stop him, Mark had already moved toward the left path. The others seemed to follow, albeit with hesitation. Alex's gut twisted. They had already lost one person. The last thing they needed was to walk into another trap. "Wait!" Alex called out, but Mark didn't turn around. The others were already trailing behind him, unsure of what to do, but unwilling to stop. "Alex, let's go," Jake said, his voice low. He seemed to be looking past Alex, down the dark tunnel where Mark had gone. "Jake," Alex's voice trailed off, and he knew the hesitation in his tone spoke volumes. He wasn't sure if they could afford to follow Mark's lead without knowing more. But it was too late. The group was moving, and Alex found himself caught in a decision he hadn't been prepared to make. As they moved deeper into the tunnel, Alex's thoughts turned back to the growing sense of distrust that had settled between them all. It was clear now, this wasn't just about surviving the zombies anymore. The real threat was the people around them, the people they were supposed to trust. Minutes passed, and the group moved further down the path. The air grew colder, the walls tighter, as if the tunnel itself were closing in on them. The soft echo of their footsteps felt like a warning, reminding Alex that they weren't alone. It was only a matter of time before the next choice had to be made. But as they moved on, Alex could sense something was wrong. The silence had grown too oppressive, and the darkness seemed to be growing deeper, thicker. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. And that wasn't just the creatures in the shadows. There was something else, something he couldn't put his finger on. Maybe it was paranoia, maybe it was the knowledge that they were all just one mistake away from becoming monsters themselves. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, but eventually, they reached another junction. This time, however, there was no clear direction. Ahead of them was a door, rusted and old, as though it had been sealed for years. It was out of place, wedged into the tunnel like an afterthought. And it wasn't the door to any maintenance room Alex recognized. "Where the hell are we?" Mark asked, his voice sharp. "This isn't right." "We should check it out," Jake said, moving forward without waiting for a response. His eyes flicked nervously around the group, as if daring someone to protest. But Alex didn't have an answer. He wasn't sure whether this door was a way out or a trap. Either way, it felt like they were running out of options, and fast. As Jake reached for the door handle, Alex's mind raced. Could he trust his friend to make the right call? Or would opening this door bring them all closer to death? With a deep breath, Alex stepped forward. "We can't just blindly open it," he said. "We need to be smart. There's something off about this." Jake shot him a look, but there was no time for arguing. With a creak of rusty hinges, Jake pushed the door open. Inside was a room that looked as though it had been untouched for years, and yet everything was still intact. Old machinery, shelves lined with unmarked boxes, and dust-covered files filled the space. But in the corner of the room, Alex saw something else. A figure. A man, sitting motionless in a chair, his back turned to them. The room was quiet, eerily quiet, and Alex felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. This wasn't the escape they had hoped for. This wasn't a safe place. "Who's there?" Mark called, his voice tight with suspicion. The man didn't respond. With one last, nervous glance at the others, Alex stepped into the room. The air felt heavier now, like they had just walked into a trap. And Alex couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched from every corner. Suddenly, the man turned, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes wide and unblinking. But there was something else. Something in the way he looked at them. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was calculation. Like he knew something they didn't. "Welcome," the man said, his voice low and calm. "You've made it this far, but the real test has just begun." A cold shiver ran down Alex's spine. The real test? What had they walked into? The door had opened, but it wasn't just a way out. It was a new challenge, one that none of them were prepared for. The man in the corner of the room continued to watch them, his unblinking eyes fixed on the group. The eerie silence in the room seemed to stretch for eternity. Alex felt his heart racing, his instincts screaming that something was wrong. The strange man's words echoed in his mind, "The real test has just begun." What did he mean by that? And who was he? Jake took a cautious step forward, his hand still on the doorframe as if ready to bolt at any moment. "Who are you? What's going on here?" His voice trembled, betraying the anxiety that had been building ever since they entered the school. The man's lips curled into a slow, unsettling smile. "Ah, the ever-curious survivors. I admire that. But curiosity can be dangerous, especially now." He leaned forward in his chair, and Alex saw his eyes glimmer with something like amusement. "You've made it this far, but the question is, will you make it out?" "Cut the games," Mark said, his tone growing more irritated. "We're not here for some twisted challenge. We need to get out of here." The man stood up, the wooden chair creaking under his weight. His movements were deliberate, calm, almost too calm for the situation. "You think you can just walk away? You think this is a simple escape?" He took a few steps toward them, his every move sending a ripple of tension through the group. "What you've entered is more than just a school overrun by the undead. This is a test. A test to see who survives and who fails." Alex clenched his fists, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. There was something not quite human about the man's behavior. His speech was almost rehearsed, too perfect in its delivery, and his eyes glowed with an unnerving intensity. "Test? For what?" Jake asked, his voice tight with suspicion. The man's gaze shifted, narrowing. "For the virus. For survival. For the next step in humanity's evolution." Alex's stomach churned at his words. "The virus? You're saying we're part of some experiment?" he asked, barely able to comprehend what the man was suggesting. The man smiled again, but this time, it was devoid of warmth. "Not just an experiment. A test of trust, of instincts, of who is worthy of survival. You see, there are survivors, and then there are the chosen." "Chosen?" Alex's voice was filled with disbelief. "You've got to be kidding. We're just trying to stay alive." The man's expression darkened, his eyes hardening. "And that's the very problem. You don't understand. You think survival is enough? That escaping the creatures is the final goal? You're wrong. This is just the beginning. The atmosphere in the room felt heavier now, like the walls were closing in. The group shifted uneasily, unsure of what to make of the man's cryptic words. But Alex wasn't going to let him intimidate them any longer. "Enough of this," he said, his voice steady. "If you want us to survive, then tell us how. We don't have time for whatever game you're playing." The man's eyes flicked toward the door as though considering Alex's challenge. He paused for a long moment before answering. "You want to know how to survive? Then make a choice." He walked toward a table near the back of the room, picking up a metal box and bringing it to the center. "This," he said, placing the box on the ground, "is the key to your survival. But there's a catch." Mark stepped forward, his patience worn thin. "What kind of catch?" The man's voice dropped to a whisper, as though he was sharing a dark secret. "Inside this box is a solution, a cure of sorts. If you use it, it will give you the strength to survive. But there's a price. Whoever takes it must become a leader, someone who will dictate the future of this group. But the decision is final. Once the choice is made, it can't be undone." The group exchanged uneasy glances. Alex's mind raced. A cure? But at what cost? Who would be chosen to lead them? And what did the man mean by a price? "What's the price?" Jake asked, his voice low and cautious. The man tilted his head, studying each of them carefully. "The price is simple. Power always comes at a cost. The chosen leader will have control over everyone else. But in return, the leader will be responsible for every life and death that follows." Mark's voice broke through the tension. "So, basically, we're all stuck in this game of survival. The leader decides who lives and who dies. That's your test?" The man didn't flinch. "Exactly. But remember, the leader is not infallible. There's always someone who disagrees, someone who wants to take control for themselves. The true test is how you handle the choices that come with it." Alex felt a cold knot in his stomach. This wasn't just a simple decision to escape anymore. They were being forced into a power struggle, one that could tear them apart. His thoughts went back to the group's dynamics, the unspoken tension, the distrust building between them. He realized that this was the real test, not surviving the creatures, but surviving each other. "Isn't there another way?" Sarah, who had been eerily quiet until now, spoke up, her voice trembling with uncertainty. The man shook his head slowly. "No. Survival requires sacrifice. And in this world, it's the strong who survive. The weak will fall." Alex took a deep breath, his mind spinning. He was no stranger to difficult decisions, but this was different. He could feel the weight of the man's words settling in his chest. They weren't just fighting for their lives against the undead. They were fighting for control of their fate, their humanity. The group was fractured, and any wrong move could lead to their undoing. Mark stepped forward, eyes gleaming with determination. "I'll do it. I'll take the cure. I'll lead us out of this." Alex turned sharply to face him. "Mark, wait. This is not something we can rush into. We need to think about this carefully." But it was too late. Mark had already opened the box, revealing a small vial filled with a strange, glowing liquid. Without hesitation, he brought it to his lips, ready to make the ultimate choice. "Mark, don't!" Alex shouted, but it was too late. As Mark swallowed the liquid, a wave of unnatural silence descended on the room. The air seemed to grow thick, and Alex felt an ominous shiver run down his spine. The real test was just beginning, and Alex knew that the game they were playing was one that none of them could win without losing something essential in the process. The silence that followed Mark's decision was suffocating. The group stood frozen, eyes locked on him as the strange, glowing liquid disappeared down his throat. Alex could feel his heart pounding in his chest, his mind racing as the minutes seemed to stretch into eternity. Was this the right choice? Could they really trust Mark to lead them out of this nightmare? Or had they just made a fatal mistake? For a few moments, nothing happened. Mark stood there, staring down at the vial in his hand, seemingly unaffected. But then, his eyes shifted. They were different now, colder, sharper, like the spark of humanity had been replaced by something darker. Alex took a step back, his unease growing. Something had changed. He could feel it in the air. The power Mark now held wasn't just physical. It was something far more dangerous. What's happening to him? Jake's voice trembled, his eyes flicking nervously between Mark and the others. His hands were clenched at his sides, ready to spring into action if necessary. Mark's lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't one of comfort. It was twisted, predatory, like a wolf among sheep. "I feel different," he murmured, his voice low and almost amused. "Stronger. More aware." He looked around at the group, his gaze lingering on each of them for a moment longer than was comfortable. "I can sense your fear. Your uncertainty." Mark, Alex's voice was barely a whisper. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. This wasn't the Mark they had known. This wasn't the same person who had been by his side since the outbreak. Something about the cure had changed him, had altered his mind, and Alex wasn't sure it was for the better. Mark laughed softly, a sound that sent chills down Alex's spine. "Don't worry, Alex. I'm still the same. Just better." He took a step closer to the group, his eyes gleaming with an intensity that was both frightening and unnatural. "The question is, are you ready to follow me? I'm your leader now. I will guide us. Protect us. But you will listen, or you'll regret it." The room grew cold. The walls seemed to press in on them, as if the very building was closing around them. The air felt heavier now, suffused with a sense of dread. Alex glanced at the others. They looked just as uneasy as he felt. Mark's transformation wasn't just physical. It was psychological. He had become a different person, and now, they were at his mercy. "We don't have to follow you, Mark," Jake said, his voice quiet but filled with defiance. "We didn't agree to this." Mark's eyes flashed, the coldness in them sharpening. "You don't have a choice. This is the world we're living in now. Survival is no longer about being nice or fair. It's about power. And I have it." Alex took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing thoughts. He knew they couldn't stay here, in this room, with Mark so close to the edge. But where could they go? What could they do? They were stuck in this twisted game, and it wasn't clear who the real enemy was anymore. He turned towards Sarah, whose expression was one of quiet fear. Her hands were trembling, and her eyes darted between Mark and the exit. She was trying to remain calm, but it was clear she was struggling to process what had just happened. "Sarah, we need to talk," Alex said softly, his voice low enough that Mark couldn't hear. She nodded quickly, stepping closer to him. "This isn't right, Alex," she whispered. "He's not himself. I can feel it. There's something wrong with him." Alex's mind raced. Sarah was right. They couldn't trust Mark anymore, not after what he had become. But the problem was, they didn't have much of a choice. They couldn't afford to turn on him, not yet, at least. They needed to survive, and for now, Mark had the power to keep them alive. But that didn't mean they had to follow him blindly. "We have to keep an eye on him," Alex murmured, his eyes never leaving Mark. "We need to find a way out of here, but we can't let him control us. Not completely." "I agree," Sarah whispered back, her voice shaky. "But how do we stop him? He's too powerful now. We're all at his mercy." Before Alex could respond, Mark's voice cut through the room. "Enough talking. I've made my decision. I will lead us. And you will obey." His words were firm, resolute, as if there was no room for argument. The group stood in silence, unsure of what to do next. They had walked into this mess willingly, trusting each other to survive, but now they were trapped in a nightmare of their own making. Alex could see the fear in their eyes. They weren't just afraid of the zombies anymore. They were afraid of Mark. "Alex," Mark said, his tone suddenly softer, almost coaxing. "I know you're hesitant. I know you don't fully understand, but trust me. You're part of this. You're with me now. You have no choice. Alex clenched his fists, the words stinging. He was tired of being told what to do. Tired of the manipulation, the lies. But deep down, he knew Mark wasn't wrong. For now, they had no choice. The world had changed, and the rules of survival had changed with it. The only question left was, how far would they be willing to go to stay alive? Let's move, Mark commanded, his voice dripping with authority. We don't have time to waste. The real test has begun, and only the strong will survive. With those words, Mark led the group out of the room. But Alex knew the real test wasn't the zombies they'd have to fight. It was Mark himself. The power he now held over them, and the price they would all pay for it. As they made their way through the dark, winding corridors of the school, Alex couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap of their own making. A trap that Mark had set. The real test, he realized, wasn't just about surviving the apocalypse. It was about surviving the monster that had once been their friend. The hallway was eerily quiet as Alex, Sarah, Jake, and the others followed Mark's lead. The school, once a place of learning and safety, had transformed into something far darker, a maze of shadows, chaos, and tension. Every step they took echoed in the silence, and with each passing minute, the group grew more anxious, more uncertain. Mark had assumed control, but the atmosphere was heavy with doubt. Was he still the person they had once trusted? Or had the cure altered something fundamental in him? Mark led them through the labyrinthine halls with ease, as though he had already memorized every turn, every room. His newfound confidence was unsettling, his every movement deliberate and calculated. The others trailed behind, each step taken with hesitation, as though they were all waiting for the other shoe to drop. We're almost there, Mark's voice cut through the stillness, smooth and cold. The final phase of the test is just ahead. Alex's heart pounded. Final phase? What did that even mean? How far would Mark push them? And what was the true goal of this twisted survival game? The group reached a large, steel-reinforced door at the end of the hall. It looked out of place in the decaying building, like it belonged to a different time, a time before the outbreak. Mark stopped in front of it, his hand resting on the cold metal. Behind this door, he said, turning to face the group, lies the answer to everything. What are you talking about? Jake asked, his voice filled with confusion and frustration. Answer to what? Mark's gaze was unwavering. The cure. The true test of survival. You see, the world as you know it is gone. The zombies are just a symptom, a consequence. The real question is, who gets to decide what comes next? Who gets to lead the world out of this hell? Alex clenched his jaw, his mind racing. He knew that the moment they stepped through that door, everything would change. The rules of this twisted game would evolve, and they'd be forced to make a choice that could shape the rest of their lives. But what kind of choice? Was it even their choice to make? Was this part of some larger experiment? Or had Mark gone mad with power? You're not making sense, Sarah spoke up, her voice trembling with fear but laced with defiance. What are you really asking us to do? Led? We just want to survive. Mark's lips curled into a thin, satisfied smile. You still don't understand. Survival is about more than just staying alive. It's about control. Leadership. Power. And this, he said, gesturing toward the door, will decide who controls the future. Alex's stomach churned. The last few days had been a blur of terror, confusion, and uncertainty. But now, standing in front of that door, he realized that this was the final moment, the moment when their fates would be sealed. Would they continue to follow Mark, their former friend who had changed so drastically, or would they fight for a chance at a different future? As the group stood there, caught in the tension between survival and control, the door creaked open. The sound was jarring, and for a moment, none of them moved. Then, Mark stepped forward, his expression unreadable. Come on. The world is waiting. Alex exchanged a glance with Sarah, who nodded as though silently agreeing with him. This wasn't about just following Mark's lead. It was about something bigger. They had to make their own choices. They couldn't let him control them any longer. Wait! Alex called out. You're not the leader here, Mark. None of us are. This is about all of us, not just one person's power. Mark's eyes flickered with anger, but his smile didn't fade. You think you can challenge me? His voice was dangerously calm. You think you can stand up to the one who holds the power to decide who survives and who doesn't? Alex took a deep breath, his mind made up. He stepped forward, resolute. Yes. Because survival isn't about one person controlling the rest. It's about all of us working together. Mark's expression shifted, and for the first time, Alex saw something vulnerable, or was it desperation? In his eyes. You don't get it. The world has changed. It's survival of the fittest. Only the strongest can lead. Only the strongest will make it. Maybe, Alex said, voice steady, but I'd rather die fighting for my freedom than live under the rule of someone who thinks they're the only one who matters. There was a long, tense silence. Mark stared at Alex, his eyes filled with a mixture of rage and disbelief. For a moment, it seemed like he might snap, might lash out. But then, something in his expression shifted. The cold smile returned, and Alex realized that this was the true test. The moment when survival wasn't about just staying alive, but about standing up for what was right, even if it meant facing the consequences. You want to defy me? Mark said, his voice low and dangerous. Then you'll be the one to suffer. Alex nodded, his resolve unwavering. We'll all suffer together if we have to. But at least we'll do it on our terms. With a sudden, swift motion, Mark reached into his pocket and pulled out a gun, the metal gleaming in the dim light. The others froze, eyes wide with fear. Mark aimed it at Alex, his finger resting on the trigger. Make your choice, Mark said coldly. Step through that door and take control, or fight me and risk everything. For a moment, Alex stood there, facing the barrel of the gun, but inside, he knew what needed to be done. He wasn't afraid anymore. The final test had arrived, and it wasn't about zombies. It wasn't even about Mark. It was about them, about survival, sacrifice, and what it meant to stay human in a world that had lost its humanity. With one last glance at his friends, Alex stepped forward, the weight of his decision heavy on his shoulders. This was the moment. The final choice. And no matter what happened next, they would face it together. Mark's eyes flickered with something, maybe regret, maybe fear, but he didn't lower the gun. The door creaked open wider, and Alex walked through it, ready to face whatever came next.